In the last post on this topic, we described a common approach to writing a self-study based on the oversight of a number, usually one per standard, of subcommittees overseen by a steering committee. And we were left with some unanswered questions. I said the approach is fraught with problems, but what are the main reasons why this approach quite often fails? What are the main areas within the approach that lead often to a poor self-study? I also said that the failure has much more to do with the way we go about the project than it has to do with any mistakes that are made by the individuals involved in the work that they undertake. So we should be able to make a better job of writing our self-study if we adopt a better method. But first, let me address and answer the questions above. What are the problems? One of the first problems is to do with consistency. Each committee is charged with addressing their standard, research or community engagement or facilities or academic programs, and they write more or less independently. The result of this sometimes is different stories are told by different authors that are not consistent with one another. One section makes reference to processes that another section describes differently or fails to mention at all when relevant, or claims directly that they don't exist. You may say, well, why won't that be picked up by the steering committee? Isn't that their job? Yes, in principle it is, but in practice it's really quite difficult to read through hundreds and hundreds of pages of text and pick up such errors in retrospect. One thing you can be sure of, though, the reviewers will spot them. The second problem area is to do with completeness. There are, in almost all accreditation and assessment frameworks, some overlaps between the standards and the substandards. This, of course, is a place where consistency, as I've just described, can also be problematic. But there's another problem that can arrive, and that's the assumption that others are making about where in the self-study overlapping topics will be properly addressed. And the unhappy result is that sometimes no one covers it at all. And that can even happen when there is no obvious overlap in the standards. Sometimes assumptions are made about a particular idea that material belongs elsewhere, and it ends up being omitted entirely. A very common problem area is repetition. With a number of writing committees engaged in writing simultaneously, there'll be plenty of places where different authors write up in great detail an approach or some background, which is also covered by often several others. I remember one particular review which came with thousands, literally thousands of annexes, supplementary documents, and among these were 12, count them, 12 copies of exactly the same document. And to make matters worse, that document evidently only existed in hard copy, so the document had to be scanned at high resolution, which meant that there were hundreds of megabytes of repeated materials to match a self-study which repeated the same description over and over. Again, it's really quite difficult to clear up that kind of mess after the problem has arisen. The next area to worry about is length. The self-study does not have to be a long document. It simply has to be complete and to address matters properly. We will talk about what a really good self-study looks like in a future vodcast, but for now, let's just note that one feature of a bad self-study is that it's just much too long. And that easily happens when the document is prepared in this traditional way, with separate subcommittees each writing a standard. No one has any control over the overall length, and indeed the balance between one standard and another is not met. Of course, the steering committee could set limits in advance, though in my experience, none has ever done so. Usually, following the steering committee's horror at receiving the first extra long draft, they'll send out the sections back to the subcommittees to be edited. But the concept of balance, noted above, is also important. Some standards are clearly more important, or at least more fundamental than others, and probably deserve to be dealt with at greater length than others. Well, I haven't even covered all the problems, but I will do in the next podcast. on the topic, but we can draw an interim conclusion. This model for preparing the self-study has some drawbacks. It is not a simple matter. We might wonder whether there's actually a better approach. Well, there is, and we will discuss it later on.